Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, yet shall they live. And whosoever believes in me shall never die. I died, and behold, I am alive forevermore. Because I live, you shall also live. Joyce Marion Check Horner was born to Leslie Lauren Check and Mildred Jeanette Shagrud on June 5, 1928, in Bovey, Minnesota. Her father, Leslie, with the unusual Swedish name, was the son of an immigrant Swedish couple. The family story is that a distant ancestor was a member of the Royal Guard with a very common name. The commanding officer assigned a different name to this person, and several generations later, that name was recorded as Check by a clerk on Ellis Island. And Joyce's middle name, recorded as Marion, I-O-N, was simply because the Czechs were unaware that the feminine version was spelled Marion, I-A-N. Mildred's parents were both children of large Norwegian immigrant families. Both were born into Lutheran families and baptized in those churches. At some point, the John Czechs became evangelicals, and John, Mildred's father, joined an evangelical gospel group, often holding street corner services. His wife, Manda Dokken, although herself with a very limited education, gained state certification as a teacher and served a one-room school in rural Minnesota. It's important to understanding Joyce to know that the John Shagruds and their daughter Mildred with her husband became almost a single unit, living together from Depression days until the Shagruds had both passed away. Dreary Depression days with jobs scarce on the Iron Range, they moved to Iron Mountain, Michigan to work in the Ford plant there. And at some point they moved back to Bovey. Bovey was one of the small towns that dotted the Mesabi Iron Range with its pit mines of iron ore. The town was the home of a famous photographer, Eric Enstrom, who was known for his photo Grace, the official photograph of the state of Minnesota. Taken in black and white, it was later colorized by Enstrom's daughter. Joyce's earliest homes were the flat above Enstrom's shop and a log cabin a few miles out in the country. The cabin had no water, and Joyce remembered she and her mother walking to her father's brother's home to get buckets full. Father Leslie suffered an accident in the mines. Perhaps it was then he was diagnosed as a type 1 diabetic. The tools to deal with the disease then were very limited, but he continued to either have a job or look for one. In about 1939, with the Depression still in force, the Shagruds and the Czechs decided to move back to Iron Mountain, where they apparently got jobs at the Ford motor plant. Joyce's education, begun in Bovey, continued in Michigan. With the start of World War II, their economic outlook improved. Unfortunately, Leslie's failure to deal effectively with this diabetes took its toll. And in 1942, at the age of 39, he died. I'm not sure why, but shortly after John and Manda Shagrud, with their grieving daughter Mildred and granddaughter Joyce, moved to Racine, Wisconsin. There, John and Mildred sought work at the J.I. Case Company, John as a security guard, Mildred riveting bomber wings. Case was a subcontractor building wings for B-24s and B-26s. Mildred was Rosie the Riveter. Seeking an evangelical church, they came to Central Church of the Nazarene in downtown Racine. My paternal grandparents were charter members, and all of their children, as well as all their grandchildren, were involved in that congregation. It was 1943 that I first laid eyes on Joyce, a gangly 14-year-old. I was not impressed. Just turned 14 myself, I was in love with Dolores Rice, a fine-looking brunette. At one of the ensuing Christmas programs, Joyce recited The Little Match Girl with feeling. I thought to myself, maybe I need to pay more attention to this one. And so a match was lit. As we grew, gradually Joyce and I were brought together in Sunday school, young people's activities, and a little later in choir. My first driver's license was issued when I was 14. Since there were no school buses in those days, and I lived 5 or 6 miles from high school, I was legal to drive the Model A Ford that Dad bought for me. But no passengers, no night driving was permitted until I attained the age of 16. At that point, Joyce and I began to see more of each other. On our first formal date in March of 1944, it was a basketball game between our rival high schools, and before long, other dates followed, and often I would take her home after Wednesday night choir practices. That following summer began the first of many medical issues that were to plague her the rest of her long life. It began with an emergency appendectomy. At the hospital, it was determined that she was a type 1 diabetic, just as her father had been. She was discharged with a healing incision from the surgery, a hypodermic needle, a couple bottles of insulin, a chart of foods for her to eat, and a scale to weigh the quantities thereof. She did not complain of the life assigned to her, and during her whole life, she never complained about any of it. Joyce simply went ahead with what was necessary and carried on as if everything was normal. And after 3.5 years of high school, Joyce graduated in January of 1946. A week later, she landed a job as stenographer and clerk in the august Racine County Probate Court of Judge J. Allen Simpson. I will never understand how a fresh out of high school girl could land such a job, taking verbal dictation by shorthand and translating it into official court documents. I doubt if such would happen today. But along the way, there was another bump. On a winter evening, Joyce was invited to a toboggan party. Riding on the rear, when the sled hit a manhole cover halfway down, it went airborne. She landed on her tailbone. In pain, the next day she went to church, and Monday she went to work. But she finally said, "Uncle." At the hospital, they announced she had 2 fractured vertebrae. After a lengthy stay, she was sent home in a plaster of Paris cast, full body cast, which stayed in place almost all of the following summer. She did complain a bit about no baths or showers, itching, and general discomfort. The following Christmas Eve, 1947, Joyce showed off the tiny engagement ring I had presented to her to the assembled family of my mother's kin. My father was not wholly pleased, pointing out the problems of diabetics. He knew of at least one sad case. Let Mom and he know ahead of time. 2 months later, his father, my beloved grandfather, died February 26, 1948. Incidentally, my grandfather had taken a liking to my girlfriend. With her broken back, he often went out of his way to give her a ride to her job at the courthouse, sparing her waiting for the city bus or walking. When he couldn't arrange it, he would, in bad weather, sometimes order a cab for her. Once or twice, he let her use his car. How can you not love a girl your own grandfather so favors? Because of the Berlin crisis and a threatened no deferment draft, I did not return to college in the fall of 1948, and I went to full-time work on the farm. But the airlift was successful in breaking the blockade. The crisis passed, the idea of the new draft was dropped, and Joyce and I set a date for our marriage. We picked February 26, 1949. Again, my father was upset. "Don't you know that is the date your grandfather died last year?" he demanded. Joyce and I consulted, but instead of postponing a month or two like he had in mind, we picked February 19th, a week ahead. Case closed. Joyce was a beautiful bride, I a proud groom. Her friend Irene was her bridesmaid. My sisters Marilyn and Catherine, junior bridesmaids. My college roommate Lynn Sewell, best man. And my cousins Jim and Betty, one from each side of the family, ring bearer and flower girl. On our 25th and 50th, we celebrated with cake again. And note that Joyce on our 50th was able to wear her unaltered wedding gown. Diabetes posed problems for us. On the farm, I would frequently leave Joyce peacefully sleeping to get things running in the morning. Then about 8, I would return for breakfast. One morning in 1955, David, our eldest son, told me he could not wake Mom up. She later confessed that she thought her sugar was high, so she gave herself a second injection. When I found her, she was totally unresponsive. We got her into the car with some help from my uncle, and I took her to the hospital. Soon the glucose intravenous solved the problem. But what worried me was that she was 3 months pregnant with our third son, Dale. I wondered about the future, and I prayed that the unborn child was not harmed, and that we might have 10 more years together. I need not have worried. All 3 of our sons were born healthy, although Dale had a breathing issue for the first couple weeks. None became diabetic, and Joyce not only survived 10 more years, she survived 63 years. As Joyce got older, management became more and more an issue. Low sugar levels or hypoglycemia became fairly frequent occurrences. Many nights I would awake to find her unresponsive. Orange juice became our friend. I would prop her up in the bed and hold the glass to her mouth. Sometimes she would respond. Other times the glass would be batted away, and the struggle might go on for some time before I could get her to down 4 ounces of orange juice. After that, in 20 or 30 minutes, she would be back. And early in her life, if not sleeping, she could sense the onset of low sugar. But gradually over the years, that ability was lost. It was lost one day in about 1978 or 79. Riding her bike in the Racine neighborhood where we lived then, she fell, fracturing her wrist. Fortunately, she was on her way to visit a friend. A friend found her, took her to the hospital, where the relatively minor fracture was repaired with a cast. She also had some pain when seated for a while. Surgeon finally removed the tailbone, which solved the problem. Another in a long series of hospitalizations. In 1983, after 34 years of vegetable growing, I said goodbye to the farm. We moved to a new life in Cody, Wyoming. 2 more significant falls took place there. Our subdivision streets had a thin layer of asphalt. There were no sidewalks, and the edges of the blacktop were gravelly. Walking with her one day, Joyce suddenly pitched forward. She put her hands down, but too far back, and with those hands as fulcrum, she pitched forward and smashed her face into the gravel. When I took her to the emergency room, I got some funny looks from staff until Joyce assured everyone that I had nothing to do with her mashed up face. I think it took at least an hour and a half for the hospital staff to dig all the gravel out. She also suffered another fall and again broke a wrist, but this time very seriously. The excellent young orthopedic surgeon that lived in Cody fitted her with an external fixator. He did an excellent job, and healing was perfect without any following issues. But then she developed an occasional swallowing problem. A couple endoscopies ensued with no definitive results. Eating, she would sometimes spit up some food, followed with considerable saliva, and then severe chills and weakness. This problem persisted until the end of her life. And then there was a series of UTIs, urinary tract infections. One so bad, a specialist in infections was called. One evening I left her wondering if she will survive until morning. Survive she does, and that's why we call her Lazarus. But there has been 2 or 3 more hospitalizations. Hold on, there will soon be another. This one may not have been caused by hypoglycemia. Hurricane Charlie has rendered our house unlivable. FEMA has rented a mobile home for us. It is parked alongside the house. There is a small stool outside the door to step down. I am out fishing when Joyce opens the trailer door. The wind catches it, and as she steps down, and she falls and breaks the other wrist. Again, there is an external fixator like the previous one. But the hotshot Florida surgeon is neither as good as his Wyoming counterpart, or the break is worse. The arm heals very distorted, and another operation is scheduled to cut short the ulna. After this, her arm is more or less straight. But that makes 2 more hospital stays to make that arm useful. And Joyce, like usual, endures all this without complaint. Never a why me. Moved to North Carolina in 2007. There are more problems. A broken kneecap, which requires surgery to repair and extensive weeks of rehab and more hospitalizations. During her lifetime, there has to be more than 20. But after every setback, Joyce comes back, and she continues her lifetime habit of walking. When we lived in Fletcher, she sometimes walks 3 or 4 miles a day in all kinds of weather. And she is finally, on her last day of walking, she falls, breaks her hip, has surgery, and is in grim determination to rehabilitate until before she finishes that, she is overcome by the stroke that will take her life in November.